Hello, and welcome to another episode of Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. So, what's the deal with objections to God? Uh, I've heard dozens and dozens of atheistic objections to the existence of God, all of which can be refuted and shot down. And I've gone over many of these objections on previous videos and addressed them. And I make future videos on other objections that I hear and I want to address so that you understand that they're flawed. These are flawed objections. One of the objections that I've heard is God was invented by the Jews, the ancient Jews. And that's simply not true. Uh, God has always been and is the creator of material reality. You can't invent God. What you can do is discover God. So one could say that the ancient Jews, let's say beginning with Abraham, discovered God. They discovered God. For instance, you know, you could build a bigger telescope and look through it, and then discover a faraway galaxy that's never been seen before. Uh, because you created that telescope, that doesn't mean you invented the galaxy. The galaxy was always there, you just didn't know it. So you didn't invent the galaxy, you discovered the galaxy. And it's the same thing with God. God is not invented, God can be discovered. But like that galaxy, God has always been. So you can't invent what has always been. You can discover it, but you can't invent it. Um, you know, some people like to object to the existence of God, claiming that the whole concept of God itself is complicated and sophisticated, and it would have to have been invented. It couldn't be something that naturally arises. And that's also false. The idea of God is not that hard to come up with. Uh, if you think of the Judeo-Christian God, the Creator God, really all you have to do to come up with the idea of God is keep asking the question, well, what caused that? And then you get an answer, and then you say, well, what caused that? And you can do this uh, continuously. And often little kids are accused of doing this very thing to their parents, continuously asking them, well, what caused that? And well, what caused that? And well, what caused that? Well, you can ultimately answer that question by pointing to something that is not caused. So when little Billy keeps asking this question, what caused that? What caused that? What caused that? Eventually, you can say God caused it, and Billy will say, "Well, what caused God?" And then you'll say, "God is uncaused. There is no cause for God," and that ends the questioning right there. So the concept of God is really not that hard to come up with. It's the ultimate answer to this string of what caused that questions until you have to come to an end, and the only possible end is an uncaused cause. We call that uncaused cause God. You can even say, well, what caused time, right? Little Billy wants to know what caused time, and you say, well, God caused time. What caused God? God's uncaused. Nothing caused God. So from that, you could say, well, God has got to be, he's uncaused. And since he caused time, he can't be subject to time. So he must be timeless. So, simple set of questions can lead you ultimately to an uncaused, timeless being that we call God. It's really not that hard a concept to come up with. Not at all. Um, Now, the uncaused, timeless God is not material, not made of parts. Couldn't be because he's uncaused. If he was caused, he would have to be made of parts. But something made of parts is contingent on those parts and therefore can't be uncaused. So an uncaused God has to be immaterial, which means an uncaused God is invisible. So even though the concept of an uncaused, timeless being is really not that hard to come up with, uh, it's an invisible being. So you can't show anybody this uncaused, timeless being. So people in ancient times wanted to worship things that they could see. So uh, the concept of a invisible, uncaused, timeless being, I'm sure, didn't go over too well with many people because they didn't want to worship uh, things they could see, whether they're the gods sitting on Mount Olympus or idols of some sort. They want to see this God. But the only real God is the uncaused, timeless God, and you can't see that God. So that sort of God is a much tougher sell for people to believe in because they can't say it. So we credit the ancient Jews for being the first group of people to discover this God and worship this God. Um, Now, the worship of God, some atheists will say, well, that's really primitive. And that belongs in tribal times when people lived in caves. And so this is the modern age. We have, iPhones, GPS satellites. Why are you worshiping a God? That's so primitive. Uh, and the answer to that is, well, we're not worshiping pagan gods. We're not worshiping, the gods that cave people believed in. We're not worshiping Zeus and Hera and golden calves and those sorts of things where you throw sacrifices, into a volcano or you take them up on a mountaintop and rip their hearts out like the Aztecs used to do. It's not that kind of God we're worshiping. We're worshiping essentially the um, uncaused, timeless being responsible for the creation of material reality. And it makes perfect sense to worship that God because that God is responsible for creating everything. The reason you're here is because that God ultimately created you. There's no better reason to worship somebody than that reason. So it's completely reasonable to worship an uncaused, timeless being responsible for the creation of material reality. There's nothing primitive about it. It's only primitive if you think in terms of caused pagan gods. And that's not what the uncaused, um, timeless Judeo Christian God is. Not that at all. Very different. Um, but you've got to understand those concepts to really be able to distinguish between pagan gods and the one true God. Another objection I hear is, well, if God knows everything, then God knows what I'm going to do before I do it. And doesn't that deprive me of free will? Why doesn't that? Why does that God let bad things happen to me? He knows what's going to happen to me. And this sort of objection, uh, you have to think about it. They're blaming God for knowing everything, and of course, God does know everything. The creator of material reality has to know everything. But if you think about it, let's say you lived 100 years, And let's say somebody recorded everything you ever did. And unbeknownst to you, but that's what they did. There was somebody in the background always spying on you, writing down everything you ever did. And you died. And then they take this book out, and somebody in the future reads it. And they now are reading everything that you ever did in your entire life. So they know everything you ever did. The only difference is you're dead and they're in the future. Well, you can compare God to that. I mean, why are you blaming God for knowing everything, but you're not blaming the person in the future who knows everything about you too? It's just that you're dead at that point, but they still know everything about you. Does the fact that that person is hypothetically possible deprive you of free will? No, of course not. So why are you blaming God? Why are you claiming God deprives you of free will when you're not claiming that the person in the future who's reading your book of life and knows everything about you is not depriving you of free will? Now think about that one. Uh, Finally, another atheistic objection I've heard about is the idea that um, the universe is only now. It's only a moment. The now. Universe is only now. The past doesn't exist. The future doesn't exist. Only now exists. Um, this sort of argument uh, was brought to us by a 18th century English philosopher named David Hume. Now, David claims that we can't know that cause and effect actually is real because the only thing we know is that the now is real. But because you can't show that the prior moment in time exists, then you can't prove it's real. Therefore, the cause of the now you can't prove is real. So David Hume denied the very existence of cause and effect. He essentially said you can't prove that cause and effect is a real thing. And because of that, David Hume argued that arguments for the existence of God, which depend on cause and effect, are invalid because you can't actually prove that anything has a cause, because everything is in the moment, is the now. So David Hume is shooting down a lot of major cosmological arguments for the existence of God, such as the first cause argument. Any argument really that depends on causation, which I think is pretty much all of them. So I've heard this argument, but it's a silly argument. It's denying the existence of cause and effect. Now, all right, you know, the thing is, it should be obvious to everyone that cause and effect is a real thing. You know, you have this now moment, but the order of the now moment is obviously logically derived from the prior moment. So that prior moment must have existed in order for the present moment to exist. That means cause and effect has to be a real thing. It has to be. Otherwise, how do you explain this logical relationship between the order of what was with what is now? It doesn't make any sense if cause and effect wasn't a real thing. Um, there's other arguments against this as well. For instance, if the now was correct, this argument was correct, what you're really talking about is a frozen moment in time. The now is a frozen moment in time. Well, frozen things can't move. They can't move. So If this was correct and it was just the now and it's a frozen moment in time, if it doesn't move and it's material, it doesn't exist. Because how would you know it was there unless it moved? So it doesn't exist. So because movement is necessary for anything material to be real, to exist, then that movement means there has to be cause and effect, which means this whole argument is wrong. It's wrong. It's a false argument. David Hume is wrong. Um, any moment in time has to have a cause. And the cause is the prior moment in time, which is slightly different, but it's changed to the next moment. That's what movement is. That's what time is. And you have to have that causal connection, or the current moment in time would be caused by nothing. And nothing can't cause something. That's a basic principle of philosophy. You can't get something from nothing. Uh, that's ex nihilo nihil fit. Uh, so you have to have causation for the moment to exist. And the only way to do that in the material sense is the prior moment. So that's why we have movement and that's why we have time. Otherwise, nothing material could exist. And that whole understanding um, proves that this David Hume's theory is wrong. It's totally wrong. Uh, all material existence depends, for its very existence, on the prior cause being real in order to cause the next moment and that movement to be real. Otherwise, it's a something from nothing, which is impossible. So you have to have movement. It has to be a real thing for reality, material reality to exist. So this is a very silly argument. But some people still make it. Uh, Another thing about the now. Albert Einstein created the theory of general relativity in physics. And under that theory, as objects come closer to massive objects in space, the massive objects in space warp space time around them. And as a result, as you get closer to those massive objects, the time for the object slows down. And because there's an inverse proportional relationship between movement through time and speed or velocity, as time slows down for that object, it also has to move faster. So it speeds up. And that acceleration is near massive objects is what is known as gravity. It's the force of gravity. But Einstein proved that time is a real dimension. It's a real thing. The movement through time, although it's invisible, unlike space, which you can see, but the dimension of time is a real thing. And if time slows down, you speed up because you're slowing down in one dimension, you're going to speed up in the other dimensions. That's been proven. Physicists have proven that. They've taken atomic clocks and sure enough, they put them at the top of skyscrapers and in the basement of skyscrapers, and they're slower in the basement of skyscrapers because they're closer to the mass of the Earth, which slows their time down slightly from the atomic clock in the roof of the skyscraper. So this is a proven scientific fact that time is in fact a dimension. It is real. It does. You get close to massive objects, it does slow time down. So if time can be slowed down, if it's a real dimension, and it is, then cause and effect has to be a real thing. I mean, what is time? Time is movement and energy. That requires cause and effect. Since time is a real dimension, cause and effect has to be a real thing. It's a real physical thing. So again, Einstein's theory of general relativity proves that this whole theory of the now by David Hume is false. It's false. Don't believe it. Cause and effect is a real thing. Um, And another thing about this silly theory is, well, why this now and not another now? I mean, it's so arbitrary. I mean, David Hume doesn't even try to explain that one. Well, why is it this now, David? Could it be an infinite number of different nows? Why is it this one? I mean, without cause and effect, how do you explain that? I mean, with cause and effect, you could say, well, it's this one because the prior one was slightly different, and that's what caused this one. Cause and effect allows you to at least explain a direct causal connection between now and 2 minutes ago. Whereas this theory of just the now, without denying cause and effect is a real thing, how do you explain now? How do you explain where it came from? How do you explain why it's this one and not another one? You can't. You can't. This is why this is a silly theory. Uh, okay. So if you ever run into this now, well, we only live in the now. There is no cause and effect. You can't prove it. Don't believe it. Of course you can. General relativity proves it exists, and for the reasons I gave you. So, hope you learned something. That I've addressed some more objections that I've heard from atheists, and I will just keep making videos and giving you the responses and rebuttals to these arguments as they come along. If you have any questions, please leave them below and I'll answer them. And please press the subscribe button because I appreciate it. And take care, everybody.